I'm Laura Smits. Welcome to the League of Women Voters of Weston's legislative wrap-up. We used to do these on an annual basis. We haven't done one in a while, but we have some new vibrant members who thought it was really important that we do. And I agree. I think it's great. If you have any questions about the League or you're interested in what we do, we have material on the back table, along with coffee and munchkins, as well as some Weston things that if you're new in town you might want to pick up. There's also, we have our own municipal candidates debate on August 7th. I'm sorry, August 7th, October 7th. Boy, I'm back there. Anyway, summer was short. I would like to, first of all, please make sure your phones are on vibrate. And if you have to leave the room, do so quietly. That's a nasty door back there, so please try not to slam it. I'm going to introduce each one of these members. This is Representative Jonathan Steinberg. He's a Democrat who represents Westport.
And Westport.
Westport. Very big territory to cover. And then we have Representative Tony Hwang, Weston, Fairfield, Easton, Westport, and Newtown, Sandy Hook. And Senator Toni Boucher is not here, never mind. Representative Adam Dunsby, Republican, representing Weston, Easton, and Reading. And I'd like to start with Representative Steinberg. And then what we'll be doing is we're going to have questions. We're going to let everyone have a minute or two. Let's not belabor it. And then we'll move on to questions from the audience, hopefully. Jonathan?
Well, thank you for having me here. I'm sure when the League scheduled this event many months ago, they never anticipated that this would be effectively the morning after or the afternoon after, but it still feels like morning to me. I've only been awake for about an hour and a half. This is a seminal crossroads for the state of Connecticut, a moment I believe needed to happen, but it's not the end of the story. And I think what we'll be discussing today, as much as what's transpired and how we got here, as what happens next. I actually think there was a healthy aspect to everything that's transpired over the past several days. I will say straight out, there are large sections of the Republican budget I really like. There were large sections of the Democrat budget I really liked, but I was one of the ones that kept it from coming to a vote Thursday night because of things I didn't like. What we really need to continue to forge is a consensus budget, which will require more concessions from both sides, and really three sides, because I think that the kicker in all this remains the governor, who has created the executive order, which will take place October 1st, which is draconian and, in my mind, ridiculous in some of its elements, just not even practical. And he's also the one who has put so many lines in the sand and dictated so many of these terms that made it impossible for the Democrats to come up with a budget that would gain enough votes in its own caucus. And if we're ever going to get to a consensus budget, presuming he vetoes this budget, which I think pretty certain, he's going to have to come to the table, even if he's a lame duck, even if he likes to be hated. He's going to have to be part of this process as well in a different way than he's been to this point. If we're going to fix things in Connecticut, it's everybody in, all in, and that's where we need to be at this point. And I'm glad to amplify further as we go along.
Thank you. Senator Hwang?
State Senator Tony Hwang, I do agree it is a pivotal moment in recent political history in the state of Connecticut. But that being said, I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And it was an incredible opportunity where the legislative body stood up to the governor and the executive branch and reflected the thoughts and the feelings and the frustrations that we've heard so many times in town halls, walking up and down Main Street, about the sense of, status quo and inertia that exists in our state government. When you listen and watch local governance, from Board of Educations to Board of Finances and the selectmen meetings, you have an exchange. You have that sense that ideas come to the bear, and ultimately the best idea or the majority of the people who support it come to bear and you act upon it. That wasn't always the way in state politics. And for the first time in my 9 years in public service, I got a sense that people were heard. and that it was not business as usual, that we had an opportunity to say, the representative body that is elected to represent you in Hartford stood up to the executive branch, stood up to the status quo and said, perhaps the Republican budget is not going to get approved and perhaps vetoed by the governor. But at least we stood up and said to the people that sent us to Hartford, you know what? We hear you. And ultimately, as I said to the number of people in the audience, this is just the beginning. What we should now focus on is every individual getting into the room. Democrat, Republican, workers, businesses. At the end of the day, we should all be in there crafting a document that reflects the best interest of the people we represent. So I'm really excited. I want to thank the League of Women Voters for your impeccable timing. And obviously I know there are issues.
We planned that.
And I'll preface and I'll close by this. In any budget that changes the status quo, there are going to be difficult decisions that are going to be made. I'm open to discussing those decisions on the Republican budget, but I will share this with you. It is a continual work in progress, and we can't have a perfect world where we look the other way, because unfortunately, we can't afford to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Thanks for the League of Women Voters for having us here today and for the impeccable timing. I mean, I guess I'll give you my perspective. So we went up there Thursday, expecting to vote on the budget. We sat there all day long, all night long. Nothing happened. We got up Friday morning.
Well, actually, a lot happened.
Nothing happened. No vote happened. But I stand corrected. Thank you.
Really works out.
Friday morning, the Democratic budget came out. Maybe some people had it sooner, but that's when a lot of us got it, and we had news we were going in at 5. So I actually went up to the Capitol early so I could read through all the details of the Democratic budget, because I assumed that's what we'd be doing that day. And I'm sitting in the back of the chamber, and people started saying, "Hey, you got to watch what's going on in the Senate." So everyone starts turning on their computers and watching the live feed from the Senate, and it was really amazing. And of course, we had people like Tony, who is always heroic and standing up for Weston and the state. But this time, you saw some Democratic senators, 3, who stood up and gave really tremendous speeches from their perspective. So if you're really interested in seeing a turning point of the state, I would suggest you go back and watch the Senate debate from yesterday of the budget for Senators Doyle, Hartley, and Schlossberg. Again, they're the ones who really changed. And I would suggest you watch those for real perspective on a turning point. And then, so the Republican budget, to everyone's surprise, the Republican budget, which then became a bipartisan budget, passed the Senate, and it came to the House. We started like 9 or so we went in? Something like that? Late, very late. And ultimately, there was a lot of discussion. The Republicans were in a different spot, because usually the ones we were asking questions this time, the Republicans were one basically explaining the budget. I mean, this budget, which I like to think of now as a bipartisan budget, that's a little more Republican. That's fine, but I mean, it got a lot of bipartisan support. I mean, it didn't raise taxes. It basically stood the line and said, we're not just gonna raise taxes again. We know we have some restraints about structural changes, given some of the other decisions we made this session, but within the degrees of freedom we have, we're going to try to make some structural changes. We're not going to defund towns. We understand that the funding mechanisms for various programs, such as education, need to change over time, but we're not just going to cut towns to zero 3 months into a year that's already started. And we discussed that budget for a long time. Representative Steinberg, obviously, and I were there all night. And at 3 a.m., that budget passed. And that's where we are today. The governor has said he's going to veto it. I really hope he doesn't. It's a really good budget. It's not a good budget in the sense that it makes everyone feel good or that everyone gets what they want. That's impossible. The state just can't do that today. We just don't have the resources. That's just not where we are. But it is a budget which basically starts to turn the corner, which basically says we're not going to raise taxes every time we have a shortfall, and we're going to try and start at least to make some structural changes. In that sense, and there are some cuts. Obviously, someone mentioned UConn. There are some cuts in there. There are some programs that are getting less that people would like to see get more. Of course, that's what happens when you have no money. The governor said he's going to veto it. I really hope he doesn't. I would encourage everyone to call the governor's office on Monday or send an email and ask him to sign the budget. This is it's a really good opportunity to turn things around, or at least start in that direction. Thank you.
Okay. Should we start with, I think questions would probably be the way to go if people have questions. And we have a mic set up in the back. You have to go up to the mic if you can. Thank you.
Hi, Dan McNeil, Steep Hill Road. My question for you is, like you just said, Adam, that the governor has said that he will veto this budget. What concessions do you anticipate you might have to make in order to avoid that from happening?
I think that's a really interesting question, because the governor has drawn so many lines in the sand. I think if we spend our time worrying about what the governor is going to veto over and over again, we are not asserting our prerogatives as legislators, and we're not going to make progress. I think, if anything, he's the one who's going to have to give a little bit. He set us up here with these executive orders and these draconian cuts. The only compromise he ever negotiated was with himself, and then claimed victory. I hate to pose him as the enemy here, but the legislature is close to standing together with a consensus budget. So, to answer your question, there are some things I would like to see him concede on so we can go forward on a budget. Obviously, issues like taxes. One of the big hangups I had was teacher pension sharing, which he is adamant about, and that cost him my vote in the House. There are a number of other things that are really problematic that the governor says he will veto any budget that contains it. I think what we need to do is come into a room together, bring people in, maybe not even the same people who have been involved. Maybe we need to disengage a little bit with the usual suspects, and come in with maybe 5 things they really want in the budget and 5 things they really want out of the budget. Let's narrow down that 10-20% where we differ at this point, and then figure, is that the path to getting to close enough? As it's been said, you're going to hate us for this budget regardless of what it is, but it's going to be the best we can do.
I mean, as far as the governor, I mean, I don't have a lot of insight into what the governor is thinking. He's clearly, as time goes on, he's really he's getting more and more rigid. Is that because he's not running again? I don't know. How much of this was posturing to try and sway votes for the what I'll call the Democratic budget? I don't know. One thing I will say though is that when the governor put forth his municipal aid runs, which all of us, and Jonathan just characterized as draconian, which is certainly as good a word as any. One of the reasons he said he could do that, because he says, well, there's no ECS formula. There's no formulas for any of these things. The legislature didn't give me any direction, so I'm just going to do it. I'm the governor, I have to do something, so I'm going to just do what I want. So even if he vetoes this bill now, he can't say that. The legislature, both chambers, have passed an ECS formula. I mean, it's very, very complicated. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of moving parts to it. But the legislature basically laid out all of those things with a formula, with all the dollar amounts, with all the details are there. So the one thing the governor can't do now is the governor can't say, well, these guys didn't do their job, they didn't tell me what to do. He can veto it, he certainly can do that, but he can't say we didn't do our job. He can't say we didn't lay these things out for him.
And Dan, I want to thank you for serving in Weston's Board of Education. And I would lead with the governor with a statement that he has repeatedly said: I will not raise taxes. He's obviously grown up Pinocchio's nose in that respect with his proposal. So I would go back to him and say, we gave you a budget that did not increase taxes, and we took care of critical issues, well, fees and et cetera. But here's the bottom line on this. We took the prioritization of holding our municipalities harmless, holding our ECS formula relatively harmless, and have a phase-in period over a 10-year in regards to the equalization between the haves and the have-nots. We addressed the issue in regards to how we can care for those most at risk and vulnerable, and we made some hard decisions. But we we emphatically said there was a conscious effort to listen to the people, again, as I started, that the status quo isn't working. And that the two highest tax increases that the governor and the majority legislative have imposed without Republican input. This is a seminal moment where both parties, everyone is in the room now having this conversation. I cannot tell you how powerful that is as a positive move forward for the people of the state and the people within Weston. People have a say, thank goodness.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Yes, Jean Marie Wiesen on Blueberry Hill Road. Thank you for your due diligence as bipartisan manner. My question is, if the governor does veto this, can the legislator not override the veto, same as in a presidential? Because the Senate has the power in a presidential veto to override.
It is certainly statutorily possible. It is part of the process which we need to respect, but I think we would all agree that there aren't the votes for it.
I hope there is.
But I think we'd all agree that there aren't the votes for it.
It's 2/3, yeah.
Hey, you know what? I'm always open for another surprise, Jonathan.
All right, good.
Thank you for the
I
question.
mean, if the budget passed, if the veto vote, if the governor vetoes it, and to Jonathan's point, if the votes were the same as they were last night, there's not that wouldn't override the veto. I think it passed, what, 24-15 in the Senate?
2150.
2150.
Sorry, and in the House it was close, 77-73.
Yes.
So to pass in the House, override veto in the House, you need 101. So you would need, what's that, like 24 people or something to change their vote, which I wouldn't say is impossible. People could change their votes, and maybe if people call their representatives, it might happen. But just on the first pass, it wouldn't be there.
Thank you. Go ahead, Woody.
Yeah, my name is Woody Bliss. I live here in Weston. My question is, with the recently approved CBAC agreement, is it realistic to think that we can ever balance the budget over the next 10 years?
It's a really good question. Without going into the gory details of the past 4 or 6 decades of how we got into this mess with the unfunded liability, I will say, having talked to the negotiators of the Office of Policy and Management, the people in the administration who have negotiated with the unions over the years, is they've been punching above their weight. We have been outmaneuvered by the unions over and over again. And understand, collective bargaining, good faith bargaining, we have an obligation to honor contracts. Having said that, it's almost impossible for us to extricate ourselves from some aspects of the deals we've made in the past. And the complication that we have today is actually outside that. That's because if we had made our annual contributions, we wouldn't be in a leverageless position that we're in today, whereby we continue to have to make deals in concessions with the unions where we kick the can further down the road. It's incredibly frustrating for all of us here. Even Tony, who's been here 9 years, was not part of any of this. This goes back to former governors and legislatures, both parties. Frankly, I think it should have been a criminal act, and some of these people should be in jail. But what we're stuck with today, all right, with Roland, you're right, you're absolutely. But to your point, what the Republican budget tried to do was to achieve some savings by concessions that will happen in 2027, which is, as I characterize, a little bit like Popeye's Wimpy saying, "I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today." It's hard to really actuarially justify some aspects of that, but it's their best faith effort to overcome what we have with CBAC, what we have with all the different union deals. I wish I had a really good answer for you for how we're going to get out of this. There was something in the Democrat budget that I worked on with a gentleman here, which actually would create a path to reducing some of the unfunded liability, which I think is a large part of the solution if we're ever going to get out of this.
Jonathan, you and I served in the House together, and I'm quite fond of you, but we don't always agree. But one of the fundamental differences is this. You're right. Past administrations, both Republican and Democrat, have failed to honor the commitment. I think it's also part of the fault of the legislature that has not voted on labor contracts. in over 23 years to allow these kind of pension and benefit largesse to continue. So I don't blame the workers, I blame the legislative body. But that being said, Rowan had a 20-year contract. It expired during Governor Malloy's first administration. He extended it for 5 years with a no layoff provision and certain guarantees. We had an opportunity this year in July to revisit that agreement, to ask for a greater contribution to the challenges we have in this state. And unfortunately, there was a vote by the legislature that locks this state in, and the taxpayers and the legislative body, for 10 more years. It offered a 4-year no guarantee provision. It offered a no privatization process. It did accept contributions from the union, but my observation was this: we should not have agreed and voted for that agreement and asked them to come back to the table. Because think about it, we were in such a rush to pass that union deal that we waited almost a month and a half to come back to do the budget. The fact was, Jonathan, you and I vehemently opposed on this. We should have never voted on that union deal that locks this state in for 10 years. We are one of only 4 states in the entire country that collectively bargains pensions and benefits. And people need to understand, it's not all unions. Our private sector unions, our municipal unions, our first responders, our teachers, our valued teachers, have their pensions and benefits set by statute. So it's not draconian and it's not unusual. We needed to bring them back to the table. But we had a 10-year agreement that was voted by the majority and locks our state in for 10 years. And during our public debate, I said 3 things were going to happen if you lock this state in for 10 years. You were going to increase taxes in any shape or form, or fees, as Jonathan mentioned earlier. You were going to hurt
taxes, Tony?
You were going to hurt municipalities, and you're going to hurt educational funding, and you're going to hurt the most at risk and vulnerable. So when we talked about the challenges for the next 10 years, remember, it didn't need to be, because we had a union deal that could have brought people to the table to share in the sacrifice. I'll give you another example and I'll leave on this. It just goads me, and I'm a state employee as a legislator. I pay 0 on my health care insurance deductibles. Who gets that?
Thank you. I'm going to welcome Senator Toni Boucher.
Thank you. I
Thank you
appreciate
for joining
it.
us,
Good to
Republican.
see you all. So nice of you to come on a wonderful, beautiful Saturday afternoon.
Okay, I
So
think,
I'll just,
yes, let's finish out this question and then we'll
right.
continue.
I think Senator Huang, I couldn't say it better than that. I agree with him entirely. I also agree with Senator Representative Steinberg to the extent that having setting a 20-year deal by Governor Rowan was a bad idea, which makes it all the more puzzling that the legislature basically just extended it to 2027. That was something we could have rejected. If we all acknowledge that it was a dumb thing to have a 20-year labor deal, why did it make any sense? How can we criticize that? And at the same time, the legislature extends it to 2027. It just doesn't make any sense. It was something we never should have done. And to Woody's point, it does, does it make it impossible to balance a budget? Who knows? And we passed a balanced budget for the next 2 years, or this year or next year. The no layoff provision, that is a problem. Like I said, all of you can lose your jobs, but state employees now can't lose their jobs. And no one likes to talk about job losses. Those aren't fun discussions to have. But we have to recognize that when the state's in real trouble, we need that flexibility. I know in my town, for instance, in Easton, we have fewer students. The schools the number of students are declining, and therefore the number of teachers has gone down. Just because you can't expect taxpayers to pay for employees that just don't have the work to do. The state didn't make that decision. The population of the state of Connecticut is declining, but now we're effectively saying we've locked in the number of employees for at least 4 years. And like I said, talking about layoffs, I mean, no one likes to have those discussions. They're not fun conversations to have. But in order for the state to survive and be able to fund the things we need to fund, we need some flexibility.
Okay, thank you very much. Woody, can I wait for you because we have other people in line? Go ahead, Ron. I think you're next.
What was the question, by the way?
Oh, the
What was
question,
the question?
You have to be on time for the...
Yeah,
it was
we'll
very,
come back to you.
it was a long time ago, unfortunately. I
Okay.
think we're going to have to skip it. I think
You
you'll
can
probably
start.
have
You can
this.
start.
There'll be a theme. I think we'll have a theme.
I think I'm sensing it.
We'll let, you
I
can,
do. I
you can
think I'm
take it. You
sensing
can take
it.
this one.
Okay.
We'll start with you.
Go ahead, Ron,
So
sorry.
I'm Rowan Baldwin, I'm from Fanton Hill Road in Weston. And I just wanted to first of all say, I think this is clearly a positive development. I want to thank the representatives from Weston and the Republican caucus for putting forth and having the courage to put forth a specific budget. And you don't get rewarded a lot today in politics with specifics and putting out things early. And I think doing that and the courage to do it, it's good to see that you are, and we're going to be rewarded, because I think our outcome will be more positive no matter what happens going forward for you all putting forth that Republican budget.
Thank you.
I did want to make a point and ask a question, which is that there are a lot of differences between the current budget, the Republican budget, and the other budgets that have been looked at and on municipal aid. But the most important one that I feel from the town of Weston's perspective is the fact that the Republican budget, and I've confirmed this with Adam, does not shift teacher pension costs onto the towns. And I just want to call that out because from our town's perspective, that is a critical issue, because we know when we start down that path, we know where it's going to end. And I'm glad to hear the representative from Westport seems to agree with that as well. So I just want to point out how critical an issue that is, and how in the horse trading that may happen to get to a final resolution, how important that issue is to our town and how critical it is that we don't make concessions on that. So I wanted to point that out and ask you, how committed are you to making sure that in a final compromise budget, if one evolves from here, that we aren't going to cross that bridge? And what can we do to help you hopefully make sure that that does not happen if the governor does veto this budget and we do end up with some kind of alternative to what's currently been passed down the road?
Okay, I'd like Senator Boucher, you can have a start with this one.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the recognition of what just occurred, because quite frankly, it is fairly historic. Of course, we had 2 historic tax increases back to back, and now what was being put in front of us on Friday morning by the majority who control the vote, the process, the budgets, we're going to enact a 3rd historic tax increase. And we put forward something that we did not have any idea would pass yesterday afternoon at 4 p.m. We did not. It was 1,000 pages. It was the 7th alternative on the table. So when people say, oh, the minority or obstructionists are party of no, that could not be further from the truth in Connecticut. And in fact, we wanted to hoist on our shoulders our staff person who is a brilliant budget analyst and provider of so much detail to help balance each line item. We wanted to hoist her on our shoulders. She literally cried when that vote came to pass, because there were 3 very courageous Democratic senators who risked everything and said they were risking their entire political career. Isn't that a shame, that a vote that you feel you must take because it's right, you could be so punished that you feel that you're putting your entire legislative career at risk? It's really very sad. And I have to say, what it was an alternative that would help Weston and Westport. Every single person that represents either one of these 2 towns should have voted in favor of that. There were 6 courageous state representatives in the House right after we passed this, that, by the way, I stayed up till 2 or 3 in the morning when it finally passed, because I was riveted, because you didn't want to, stop what our alternative would do was not shift the costs of the state for teachers' pension that was paid and a responsibility of the state since 1970 to our towns. It would not have enacted a quasi-agency to enact tolls without legislative oversight. It would not have taxed cell phones, and worse yet, would not have taxed you on your second home anywhere in Connecticut, anyone in Connecticut. And that did not just include non-residents. It's every one of us. in this. If you had a rental property or some other property in the state, this was unbelievable because it was doubling down on policies that have put us in constant deficit mode. So you can see how vehement we are, and what can you do? What was done that led us to this historic moment, which you'd pray that a governor would see this and vote in favor, or at least sign something, or even, you don't even have to sign it, by the way. You can just let it pass just by leaving it on the, without a signature for 30 days, it would become law. Would see that this is something that was a bipartisan effort. And by the way, those state senators that risked everything, Democrats, you can bet they're not going to change their stripes now, not after they put everything on the line. So you can imagine what's going to happen between now and hopefully October 1st. You know, it's going to be, and what happened with that real estate additional tax, that statewide property tax, in other words, you're going to be taxed on that second home here in whatever town it is in, but then you're just going to have another tax that's a state tax, which opens the door to state control of your local property taxes. Because since I've been there, that's the movement I feel.
Okay, I'm going to...
Thank you, go ahead.
Representative Steinberg, do you want to
I wanna
answer this
respond
part
to
of
the
this question?
I hope that's okay. When the governor came out with his proposed budget in February with the teacher pension sharing, I made it very clear to my caucus that I would never vote for that. And it was not in our budget until a week ago, when they capitulated to the governor. And they lost my vote, and they lost their ability to pass the Democrat budget. To answer your question directly, it's the governor you have to work on. He has insisted he will not approve a budget that does not include pension sharing. He is the problem.
Thank you. Now you can, Senator Huang.
No, I
Are
wanna
we done
thank
with that question? Should we move to the
I want
next?
to thank the league again, and I always enjoy the League of Women Voters debates when there are lovely volunteers up there with signs for all of us to say, you have a minute left to speak.
But sir, this is not a debate. This is a little more... This is not a debate. P.S. This is not a debate.
Rowan, I would just say, no, you know, I've talked about this before. I mean, Representative Steinberg is exactly right. It's the governor who is just fixated on this. He won't let it go. But I just briefly, and I think I've talked about this before. I mean, you've correctly identified the issue for a town like Weston, or Westport, or Easton, or Reading. The teacher's retirement, that's the real ticking time bomb, because that's something new. Anytime a new charge, a new tax, basically municipality tax is what it is. Anytime the state does something new like that, they're allowed to get away with it. Even if they say it's only a nickel today, it's going to be the entire thing in 5 years. And even though it might only be 1% of Weston's budget today, you're opening up the prospect that it could be 10% of the budget 10 years from now, because there's people in the legislature who'll be perfectly fine with that. So you correctly identified that issue. It can't be allowed to happen. As Representative Steinberg said correctly, it's the governor. And when you call the governor and ask him to sign the budget that passed this morning, you should mention that to him as well.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to the next question, if we can.
This is really high. Is there a way to lower this? Okay. Hi, my name is Gail Barrett. I'm from Westport. Based on the comments so far, I feel like I'm in the minority here, but from what I'm hearing about the budget that was passed, it does not sound like a very compassionate budget. There's a number of cuts, I think, including in early childhood education, in support of seniors, et cetera. I also want to make a statement about the fact that from what I've discussed with some of you, actually, I'm not sure that the Republican budget is legal when it comes to how you deal with union contracts. I'm a lawyer, and I certainly don't want to see money tied up in fights in courts to try to enforce things that are not enforceable and that we should know are not enforceable. Another comment is that my understanding is that the budget does not reduce. The budget reduces pension funding, which is kicking the can further down the road. So those are just some statements. I actually have a question. Senator Boucher, you wrote me recently stating that you've been a supporter of the Citizens Election Program in past years, which provides public financing for statewide offices. Yet you voted for a budget that eliminates the program, putting elections back into the hands of corporations and special interest groups. Eliminating this program saves negligible amounts in comparison to the overall budget deficit. Will you work to reinstate funding?
Well, thank you for that question, and I'm glad that you recognize that I was one of the few on my side of the aisle that actually originally voted for that program. I'm a strong supporter of that program, as I am also for the Community Investment Act funds, for the Green Energy Fund, for a lot of the things that were tampered with in this budget. There are many things in both of the budgets that we did not like. And we, it wouldn't, if we were able to protect our individual line item, it would be wonderful, but it was not possible. We had to come to an agreement as a whole. And as such, many of us had to swallow hard and say, what's the greater good right now? We are in serious trouble. We have a $3.5 billion gap that was originally $5 billion. We've been told that we're going to be in billion-dollar deficits going forward. These are very tough times and very tough decisions that have to be made. Yes, I will continue to be an advocate. I'll continue to fight in our caucus to protect that, as well as generally. But we also have to recognize that is it better to protect the disabled, the seniors, the businesses that are here that are leaving in droves? My business has had to shrink a good deal. Some of us work in the private sector. This is a part-time legislature. You get a stipend. Yeah, you get access to that great health care plan and all of that, which we've tried to change, actually put in bills that would erode our own, whatever the benefit is in health care. But I live in the real world, and it is not a good time in Connecticut. So, as you can see, I am passionate about the citizen election program. I don't come from big money. For people like myself, this is a real benefit to try to help us to run for office to serve. So it is something that I value. Unfortunately, by the way, that was eroded right after Jody Rell enacted it by the other side of the aisle, and the League of Women Voters stood up with us to say this was wrong, starting to get lobbyist money, even just $100. Now they're increasing all of that. I certainly don't support that. But as I said, this was a compromise moment that had to be done.
Thank you.
I actually would like to respond to that as well.
Give you the opportunity.
I think the point you made, there's not a lot of money, relatively speaking, involved with this. Let's call it what it is. It's a political partisan effort. The Republicans have been trying to kill CEP for years. If you listened to me at midnight last night when I spoke before the legislature, as much as I liked many aspects of the Republican budget, a lot of the structural changes, I could not vote for a budget that included eliminating CEP. And the League has been an important champion and partner in this. And I would say if there's anything that you need to see happen changing in the consensus budget, CEP needs to be reformed, but to eliminate that would to basically foreclose the kind of true democratic, free, independent ability for people to run for office and for us to vote for people like that for office. It was enough for me, small amount of money, for me to vote against a Republican budget that I thought had a lot of merit. And I'm really glad you brought this up.
And I would follow by saying, I do think it is an opportunity to reevaluate, to reduce some of the allotments. That was some of the initial considerations on CEP. I believe in CEP, but I also understand what was said. But Jonathan, I'm going to have to correct you again. Here's the deal. Last year, it was the majority legislature that proposed the elimination of CEP. And I applaud you.
Senate, your chamber, not mine.
I applaud you, as you and I both have agreed, to have supported CEP. I think you and I complimented you when the General Assembly and the governor eroded the Citizens Elections Program by eliminating limits on contributions. And I will say this, just as I disagreed with him on the union deal, he was one of the few Democrats that came forth and supported it. So I'll call it as I see it. The fact is, we do need to have some form. But one of the more critical things that I think we should really hone in on, that we as a legislative body worked on 2.5 years ago, was let us find out the source of the dark money that resulted from Citizens versus United, all right, the United States. The fact is, we in the legislative body proposed, with the help of the League and the Government Administration Committee, to expose and to shine the light on the dark money paths. It passed the legislative body in the Senate and the House. Governor Malloy vetoed the bill and has never resurfaced again. So when you talk about money, I would simply clarify by it isn't simply a Republican or Democratic issue. It's political expediency. And that is something we need to be rid of. And I think the first point you attack on is the reasonableness of assessing where the money is coming from, the accountability of where that money's coming from. And I want to applaud the League for being very supportive of that. And I want to compliment Jonathan. He has been a very strong supporter, and we've been unified in that. So there you go, we agree.
Oh, here, here. There it goes. Newsflash. CEP. Okay, thank you very much. We're going to go to the next question.
Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Ezzies on Georgetown Road. I'd like to thank you all for being here. Jonathan, in particular, I think it's fantastic that you would come to this meeting in Weston and offer...
Not that much foreign territory.
I don't know. You and I both served in Westport government. It's a little bit different, believe me. My question is a fiscal question, and it's a follow-on to Woody's. So when we plan here, financially plan here, we don't plan for a single year. We plan for multiple years. So as an example, as recently as last Thursday, when we thought there was a possibility that this transfer of teacher pension expense might become a reality, we've already entered into discussions with our town council as to whether or not this can actually be done on a legal basis, and we are prepared as a town to fund that study. And our town council thinks there's some validity to us going forward. Hopefully we don't have to do that. But my concern is this. So my concern is we've been a very fiscally prudent town. We have a large surplus. But as I read the analysis from the Office of Policy
And Management.
it indicates that regardless of which budget is passed, we're going to find ourselves in a similar position from a deficit point of view starting in fiscal year 2020. And the cumulative number is not appreciably different than the numbers we're all dealing with here. That makes our job particularly difficult, because if I'm looking at that number and that's looming out there, I'm just going to have to become even more fiscally conservative over the next couple of years till I have to face that next hurdle. So as you're putting together this budget for the next couple of years, how are you going to take that into consideration, knowing that the numbers from a bipartisan number says we're just moving this off another couple, 3 years?
Steve, was that directed at someone specific?
No.
Okay,
no,
then I will start with Representative
because
Dunsby.
I view what transpired over the last couple of days as to be a positive, because now everyone, regardless of party, will have to get into the room and have this conversation.
Thank you.
So Steve, I may ask you just to clarify some of that. I mean, to the issue of the legal matter of the teacher's retirement switchover, I mean, if your attorney thinks he has a legal theory to prevent that, I would certainly encourage you to pursue that. I'm probably not the best person to respond to that. I'm not aware of any.
No, I'm not asking you to respond. I'm just telling you, I only said that specifically to say this is what we're thinking of. We're thinking we have to be reactive or proactive, excuse me, to any scenario.
I mean, as you probably know, I mean, the legislature has been historically very poor at long-term planning and putting a long-term financial plan together, which is why we're in the position we're in now and have been and will be, and why we're so reactive. I mean, we do need to get through a 2-year budget. That's effectively the law. I mean, at least it's 2 years. It could be 1 year, right? So at least have that. And we need to put into effect forcing ourselves to pay down the obligations, the pension obligations, which we haven't done in the past and need to do in the future. And we need to make some structural changes too. Obviously, the long term, what we all hope for, everyone in this room hopes for, is that the Connecticut economy will turn around, and that will raise up the revenue streams, as was the case in the '90s, where it was the rosy days. I wasn't here for that. Maybe you were. No. But that's what we can hope for. So I think as far as what you can do is try and hold your legislators and the governor accountable for thinking long-term and thinking past the election cycles, which I want to be overly critical because I'm new, but obviously that's been part of the issue in the past.
That makes a really critical point about growing the economy. That's the only path out of this. Anybody who believes that even with this budget that we've really turned a corner hasn't looked at the numbers with the unfunded liability on the teacher's side and on the state workers' side. I've been working with others on both sides of the aisle to start to articulate a credible message that we will have a plan for lifting our cities, for creating good paying jobs, for encouraging and growing certain sectors like bioscience. And I got to give Senator Hwang a lot of credit. We worked together on the bioscience opportunity, which is blooming in the state of Connecticut. If we can keep these startups and companies like Alexion here until we reach critical mass, it's a challenge for us. But there is a path out for us, and that's the only way we get past this. And I just want to add one comment. We should remember how blessed we are here in Westport and Weston. We live in a bubble. The reality that's coming forward for mayors and first selectmen across the state about the real implications, just looking at the governor's draconian executive order, suggests that they're going to face new realities, and they don't have the wherewithal we do to maintain good reserves, to have a good grand list. The ramifications across the state are far more significant than we're going to feel here.
Senator Hwang?
I would just caveat that that is one of the misnomers up in Hartford, that we are indeed in a wonderful part of the state. But I can share with you that there are people in Westport, there are people in Weston, there are people in Fairfield that are struggling, that cannot make ends meet, that were one paycheck away, that are seniors on fixed income with incredible high cost and increased taxes. So it's not just us living in a bubble. I think we need to fully understand that the policies and the direction we implement sends a loud and clear message. I spoke with GE executives, persuading them to stay. Yes, have they moved because their corporate culture and processes have changed, and Boston's a more interesting town, but they also looked at Rhode Island. And what they said was, ultimately, our pension and our benefits liability as a state has become so untenable, and we've shown no courage until yesterday to have done things differently, that they were leaving because the ecosystem of our state, we can talk anything we want. We can have some of the best genomic and biotech scientists in this state. But the fact was, Alexion, that was just cited, decided to move to Boston because the ecosystem, the way we do business, the way we impose taxes, the way we don't conduct business in a predictable manner, and that we pick winners and losers in an unsustainable way. At the end of the day, yes, we need to create jobs, we need to help our businesses, and the best way would be is for government to be a partner, not to be the driver of entrepreneurialism. And unfortunately, government has been the biggest employer in the state of Connecticut. We need to turn that upside down. The government needs to be in a position to empower our businesses and sometimes stay out of the way. That's how we can innovate. That's how we can be entrepreneurs.
Thank you. Senator Boucher.
Thank you. It's interesting that Alexion has been brought up as a pharmaceutical company. It's just one of the latest big firms that have decided to call it quits. It's great to have a wonderful message, a great vision for growing the economy. That's great. But when your policies contradict that over and over again in this budget, some may pick on the Citizens Election Program, but in that budget was a very anti-business proposal to extend medical leave, not 16 weeks, but 32 weeks. The business sector went crazy when they saw that in there. There were all sorts of things in there. So when you see that the actions being taken are absolutely opposite of what you're saying, you've got to be aware that it's the policies that are driving people away. It's the taxes that are driving people away. And to your question about your legal rights, and you also mentioned the legality of some of the components of this alternative budget that might tamper with collective bargaining in some way. Those are all uncertain. And if you're not willing to take the courage to actually put that in there in a way to solve a massive problem and test that, you should test it. Because that's where we are right now. Things are so critical, so dire, that it is time to push the envelope, to test the legality of it, because no one can give us a straight answer whether it is or isn't legal. And I think we do need to push it. And by the way, there is a caveat in some of this that if we are in extreme dire situation, that some of the legal terms of some of these contracts can be challenged, can change. And in my view, this is the time to do it, because we are driving our jobs away, and that hurts everyone else at every level of that economic ladder. There's no question. It's not just the CEOs and the pharmaceutical technicians or even the research scientists. No, no, no. It is all of the people that work in dry cleaning establishments, that mow the lawns, that sell the pizzas. They're all suffering. My diners. And my grocery store, a lot like Pete's Market, we have a Village Market as well. I asked the manager, he said, Tony, we're struggling. This is so hard. And all my suppliers, both for meat, for fruits and vegetables, they're hanging on by thread. And they, by the way, serve all over the state. So it's just not Fairfield County. We have a massive problem that has to be dealt with. And some of the things that we would like to have and protect, right now, they're taking second place right now to the bigger issues.
Thank you. Representative Dunsby, anything to add on this, or shall we move on to the next question?
I started, so we can move on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Effie.
Hi, Effie T. May from November Trail. I have two, one seeking information, actually both of them are seeking information. One, special education excess cost funding. Did the formula change? My understanding was that it would be shifting from following the student to flat funded each year, and I would like some clarification on that. Number two, what needs to be done? You guys are the lawmakers in conjunction with the governor. What would need to be done to change the fact that we are one of those 4 states that collectively bargain state employees? How can we make it by statute? Is that possible?
Well, start this side, or?
Well, to answer your first question, as much as I understand large parts of the Republican budget, I didn't have a chance to finish reading it yesterday, so I cannot answer your special ed question. Suffice it to say that every caucus in the governor's budget had a slightly different approach to that. I don't know where we net out. Go ahead.
Can I jump ahead?
Yeah.
Yeah, Effie, so it's...
Did you finish your sentence?
I handed off.
I was going to just...
Okay, as long as you hand it off politely. Okay, go ahead, thank you.
It's not the, it's a block now. It's done like the ECS money in the Republican budget. So it used to be the excess cost 4.5 times the town pays, then above that the state would pick up about 70%. It's different now. It's a fixed amount in the Republican budget, this budget that passed, as it's been in most of the budgets. It's a fixed amount, but it's still tied to your special education expenditures. That's actually one I kind of wish we had left at the excess cost share. Actually, I think that's a little bit better for reasons I think it's a little bit better. But that is, to answer your question directly, that's what it's in the budget that passed last night. It's not, flat fund is not the right way to think about it, but it's a block grant tied to previous year's expenditures.
You're heading it back? Good, okay.
Well, and
So Tony,
just go back to Jonathan.
And to answer your second question, I think this is the crux of a lot of our ability to get out of where we're at. I didn't want to vote for the CBAC agreement. In fact, I was prepared to vote against it. But I started talking to lawyers, and I don't like talking to lawyers, but still.
I was a lawyer. I won't take it personally.
Okay. Some of my best friends are lawyers. The problem is, as you heard, there was genuine disagreement. And even when the Attorney General's office, to which Senator Boucher alluded, said it under extreme circumstances, there was a lot to be said on both sides. Part of the problem, we're one of the wealthiest states in the country. There are always options, things we don't like raising taxes that are an alternative to abrogating collective bargaining. What would have happened, in my view, if we had turned down CBAC, at the very least, whether we wanted to renegotiate with the unions or whether we wanted to take it to court, it would have taken us the better part of a year, and $700 million of savings would go by the wayside, and we have to find that someplace else. But the point you make is the critical one. How do we get past this? Do we want to contemplate a Wisconsin moment and abrogate collective bargaining? I'm not there, but I do believe that we have to find some way to unravel this absolutely Byzantine contractual relationship with state workers if we're ever going to get past this. The path may be along what Senator Boucher has said. At some point, we have to challenge things, but I want to challenge it on a sound basis. I don't want to waste money with lawyers and end up losing at the end of the day. I think this is a conversation we need to continue to have.
This is a very important question. It's something I've been embedded in on education funding for a couple of decades, quite frankly. You should note that, in fact, the Republican budget actually allocates more generally to education across the board and sets out an ECS formula that's based on factors rather than politics. And right now, it's who's on what committee, what town is in favor. It's absolutely political, and it's wrong. So we set about having an actual ECS formula that's based on those court cases, that's based on wealth and children that live in poverty and so forth, that will be fair and transparent across the board. That is particularly important, as well as sets in process a way to review those factors in the next year, so that everyone can come to agreement on it. But with regard to special education in particular, because that is an incredibly important area right now of education in our towns and in our states, it is similar, as was just mentioned, to what the governor does to transfer a portion of it, approximately 22%, in fact, and combines $447 million with the current excess cost account and an additional $10 million. It then creates a pool that is generally $597 million. And the distribution will range between 2.5% to 52% and be distributed on the base of an equalized grand list of municipalities similar to the governor. But unlike excess cost, the distribution of these funds will be based on the previous year's expenditures rather than a town waiting until the expenditure of a child hits 4.5 times their per pupil average. So there was a lot of work being done on this through this process on the Republican side, and I think generally they tried to be as fair as possible and not hurt as many towns as in the governor's budget and what it intends to do.
Thank you.
I'll just come back to the, you asked two questions, Effie, so I mentioned especially the collective bargaining. So I guess I'll say two things. So one, I'm new. So when I went to Hartford, I knew the unions were powerful. I really had no idea. I mean, you really need to think about the unions as a fourth branch of government, the public sector unions as a fourth branch of government to really understand, I think, to understand the dynamic of the legislative process in government. And not much of it happens out in public, but when you read through the fine print of lots and lots of these bills, I mean, you can really, really see what's going on. To the issue of collective bargaining, so my views have evolved on this, in part because being first selectman of East and now in the legislature. So collective bargaining, just the notion of you have to sit down with the employees who can organize whoever they choose and talk to them, that's great. I mean, that collective bargaining, I mean, I think it's a wonderful way to do it. I don't see why you'd want to do anything different. The issue is the mandatory binding arbitration, which basically says if, we'll call it management and the employees don't agree, then basically effectively the state or some board gets to decide. And basically what that board always does is looks around what everyone else is doing and say, well, you have to do the same thing, and now that's the law. That I don't think is working for Connecticut. I certainly support mandatory binding arbitration for classroom teachers, for frontline public safety people who we can't basically just have to be, the cost of society of them being out of their jobs is just too high. But say a Parks and Rec department, if a town can't agree with the Parks and Rec union, does that really need to go to mandatory binding arbitration? I'm not so sure about that. So while collective bargaining, as I just mentioned, I think is great, the right way to do things. I'm not really a supporter of mandatory binding arbitration for every group. Some groups, yes, classroom teachers, frontline public safety, but other groups, I don't think mandatory binding arbitration works.
Can I supplement that? Do you agree that collective bargaining of the pensions and the health care benefits for the state employees should remain there, given the fact that we discussed earlier that they're the only ones who don't have those set by statute?
No, I think you should collective bargain for wages, for workplace conditions. I think it's fine for the state by statute to set broad policies, like this is the health plan we offer, here are the options that we offer. Here's the retirement plan that we offer. I think that can be done by statute. I don't think that needs to be collectively bargained. I mean, no one's forcing people to take jobs, right? I mean, the state's employer is allowed to offer, here's what we have. It's the state of Connecticut, you know it's going to be very good, but I think the state should have some leeway to say, well, this is what we think we want to offer, the benefit package we want to offer, and we think this is what will attract the right kind of person, the caliber of person we want to the state. I don't think once you hire a person, you effectively have to go to court, I'll say, to talk about every aspect of, say, retirement benefits. I think that the legislature should be able to legislate those, as you point out, like most states do. Okay, I'll
Thank
let
you.
go.
Okay, I think we're going to move to the next question.
Good afternoon. Mike Imber, Weston, of Weston on Glenwood Road. First, I very much appreciate the very respectful, bipartisan, collaborative approach the panel and the whole audience is taking. So I think this is a terrific conversation. Yesterday, I was a participant in the UConn Law School's symposium on municipal distress, and an interesting question came up that I would have loved to have had you guys there to talk about this. So
You're just a little busy.
you were distracted.
I was there for part of it.
It's totally distracted. It's a two-part question. First is, would the governor's veto of this budget assure a Chapter 9 filing of Hartford? And if the answer to that question is yes, will the bankruptcy of Hartford, as well as the state's failure to have a budget after October 1st, create a contagion effect that will drive up borrowing costs for cities and towns all over the state?
I have to leave shortly. Do you mind? I apologize
got
to
here.
the league. I know, I had 5 events between 9 o'clock this morning,
No
and
worries.
I have to get to Ridgefield before, you know.
Go ahead,
Okay,
Senator,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I apologize.
Go ahead, Senator
First
Boucher.
of all, Mike, thank you so much. He's really, you are an example of the intellectual resources that we have in this state that should be tapped over and over again, because we could solve a lot of problems by using the expertise that you bring to the table. And I will answer your question, but I also wanted to remark that, in fact, I've been there a long time, and it's always been dominated by a Democratic legislature, House and Senate, which drives the budget and votes. The governors can only propose. And so I can tell you that it's changed. Okay, because you couldn't tell the difference between myself, who is socially liberal and very financially conservative, than any other Democratic leadership person there. But it's changed dramatically, especially in the last, I would say, easily 7 to 8, 9 years, that now, because we have private sector jobs, the people that are now in leadership positions now work for the very unions that negotiate the salaries of the state employees. So the conflict is huge, and the outsized influence they have is why we're in such a predicament, number one. Okay, number two, your question was about the veto. And in the governor's budget, he actually had, I think, a $40 million bailout for Hartford. $46 million bailout, okay? A lot of us didn't agree with that. They actually have a fairly good mayor right now, which they have not had. And Waterbury, which is my experience, okay, had the same problem, if not worse, because one administration after another, and in Waterbury, they had Republican and Democratic mayors, not in Hartford. And Hartford, it's always been, what they did was they gave away everything until it became impossible to pay. The Ponzi scheme stopped, and somebody had to pay. They went for Chapter 9. By the way, Detroit just did this, and it's coming back, by the way. Restructured those contracts, which they couldn't do otherwise. So the idea of a Chapter 9 isn't always a bad thing, because that helps them to make those really important decisions. The union just won't sit down and agree. They just won't. So for them, should the state be bailing them out? The state can't go Chapter 9. Or what have you, and you're asking all of the rest of the towns to bail out what has been one bad policy and administration after another, mismanagement, just like the state now wants to bail itself out because the town of Weston has 401k plans and all of the things that they should have done in the interim to close it. And my parting comment is that, quite frankly, if the state employees accepted the same benefits as all your teachers and your police and fire right here in Weston, we would solve our problems, our financial problems, and it's fair, because no teacher at Nora Community College works any harder than any teacher here in this town, and no police and fireman works any harder than the State Department of Homeland Security.
Okay,
On that
thank you,
note,
Senator
thank you
Boucher.
so much, and I
Thank you for
apologize
coming.
profusely. I've just got to be on the road and hit as many
Okay.
of our towns as I can.
Thank you. I think,
I'll just say quickly, I actually agree with Senator Boucher that bankruptcy may be inevitable in order to get the kind of concessions necessary to get Hartford back on its feet. The idea that you put forward, which might actually free up some real estate that is currently state-owned and would suddenly be generating tax revenues for Hartford, I think is a brilliant idea that was in the Democrat budget. We need to get into a consensus budget, and we can go into that later. You don't know what I'm talking about. But I do share your concern that if Hartford goes under, it will have an impact across the state on borrowing and on the perception. So that is the risk we take in letting Hartford go bankrupt.
Is it inevitable, Mike? I don't know. Hartford's going to make their own decisions. So Hartford gets, just so people understand, Hartford gets $280 million of state aid right now. Over 1% of state spending is a grant to the city of Hartford. They're saying Mayor Bronin, who I agree, I've heard him speak, he seems to be very, very good. He's basically, they need 40 or 50 million more, and I think that's really just to get by. There's talks of structural change. We all talk about structural changes. I'm not sure how much is really there. Again, I'm not going to take a position that they should or should not go bankrupt. People will say that, well, if they go bankrupt, this is a huge stigma for the state. And I would say, well, what is it now? We're going to lick along with Hartford saying this every year, because there's no other way out. Short of economic boom, there's no way out of this. Even if we give them money, if the state you give them money, it's only to get us to the next 2 years, really. That's all it is. As far as the stigma, the example I use is, last time you flew an airline, did you check if that airline had ever gone bankrupt? Probably not, but most of them have. Today, you don't care. If it went bankrupt 10 years ago, Continental or whatever it was, you don't care. You go up, you find the cheapest flight, you take that today. You assume it's going to get you there. So the idea that it's a huge stigma for the state if Hartford went bankrupt, I don't really buy that. I think it really, again, worse than what? Bigger stigma than we have now? I don't really see that. I could see that being taken as bacon. Okay, well now, someone at least is taking a forceful step. Because the bankruptcy, and you're more of an expert at this than I am, but the bankruptcy status allows you to take steps that you can't otherwise take, because you're allowed to do things like revisit contracts and so forth, which you can't do now. So, again, I'm not going to take a position whether Hartford should go bankrupt or should not go bankrupt. That's a matter of their own finances. But the view that they shouldn't, just because there's some stigma associated with that view, I don't agree with.
As Representative Dunsby said, Connecticut has had a rough streak lately, but I consider it a punch to the stomach. I do not believe we should allow Hartford to go bankrupt, because I think it denotes a knockout punch that undermines any confidence of investment vehicles, not only nationally, but internationally, that the state of Connecticut and its municipalities cannot fulfill its obligations. That being said, the Republican budget allocated $9 million instead of 40 to insist on significant oversight and corrective measures on how you run municipalities. And when I said earlier in the beginning of the program, and it's a compliment to all the people that are here on a beautiful Saturday and our town leaders and from both sides of the aisle, is there's tremendous accountability. There's a tremendous commitment to public service in your community. Because guess what? You go down to the market, you walk up and down, you bring your kids to school. There is accountability and there is an involved constituency. What's remarkable to me was 2 years ago when Luke Burnham was elected mayor of Hartford, less than 5% of the eligible voters in that town voted. There is a complacency beyond reproach. So I think it's a two-way street. This kind of engagement is critical, but no, we do not, and we should not allow Hartford to go bankrupt. So the Republican budget had some seed money to allow them and force them to begin the responsive representative government that they need to have. But we did not include $140 million to bail out a quasi-public Excel center. Could that money be better used to help restructure and reallocate government? I believe so. So I will say again, it should not be something that is hung on the head of this state, no matter how economically difficult we are challenged, to allow any of our municipalities to forfeit on their obligations and bonds, because when that happens, the rug will be pulled under. Every one of our towns will have an asterisk as to whether they can afford to borrow money at a good market rate.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next question, Bob?
Well, this meeting has been quite an upper, I have to say. Just two thoughts, and then I'm going to leave you with a question or a thought. I mentioned this to Adam the other night, and I'm not sure if I got very far. Or
Oh, sorry, Bob. Can you say your name and street? I'm sorry.
Bob.
Maxon.
Maxon.
And your street.
Bob Maxon, White Birch Ridge in Weston.
Terrific. Continue.
Okay. The problem here is I think that we've agreed that this $50 billion overhang of pension obligation is either going to go away because we are going to somehow renegotiate a contract which idiotically we've agreed not to touch, or Governor Malloy has agreed not to touch for 10 years, or if there is enough of a crisis, we will somehow use that as leverage in courts to undermine it. Or the other option is that we're going to have such fantastic growth in this state that we will pay it off with more revenue. And if you ask for a show of hands, which I'm not doing that, I don't know that anybody believes that's going to happen in the state of Connecticut. I mean, I don't. But I don't want to walk around with this Jimmy Carter-esque type malaise on my shoulders for the next 10 years, and I think that's what we're all kind of feeling. So here's my question and my thought. I raised this with Adam before. The state of Illinois is doing this. A Northwestern economics professor, Robert Gordon, who wrote an incredible book on the decline of the American living standard, has suggested that one of the ways we can get out of our contractual pension obligations is to pay them off. And it has been done before. And obviously, in that respect, we avoid litigation, and we avoid what happened in Wisconsin. I mean, I like the result in Wisconsin, personally, but I think we all agree it was an ugly, ugly scene, and I would not want to see that in the state of Connecticut. We are at, and this is bizarre, I really did read this also in the same book, we are at the world's lowest period of inflation. Not just like recently, in the history of the world, inflation and the cost of borrowing have never been this low, period. It's a remarkable time in world history. The proposal, and I don't expect you to say yes or no, I know that people in this state have suggested it, is to use this period of time, and I believe there has been some change in law with respect to issuing tax-free bonds to at least get some of our pension obligation off our backs by going certainly to the younger retirees and those older retirees who might be thinking, holy cow, the state's talking about default and litigation. Maybe this is a good time for me to be bought out of my pension obligation, and to use that opportunity. Because as I said at the beginning, the idea that we're just going to magically get out of this overhang, I don't think is realistic. And I hope that we can find some other alternative to that.
Thank you.
To answer your question simply, I think it's an interesting idea. The problem is we maxed out our credit card. We've looked at this. We're one of the highest indebted per capita states in the country. If we didn't have such a difficult bond situation, we might contemplate being able to pay this off, but I'm not sure you can go outside that.
Tax-free debt I'm talking about. And so the people in Connecticut would whip that stuff up in a minute. In a minute. Tax-free debt at 2% would go, I mean, I'm not a bond expert.
Right. It's still debt.
I would offer this as as an internal optimist is this: we are in dire straits with our pensions and benefit obligations. But there's a glimmer of hope because in learning about what happened to Rhode Island, you had a incoming Democratic governor who was the treasurer. And when she was a treasurer, she had the courage to stand up and say, we need pension reform, to the point that she nearly lost in a supermajority Democratic state. And then with a supermajority of Democrat senators and representatives in Rhode Island, in her first 18 months, she demonstrated discipline in pension reform, Bennett reform, corporate regulations, tax reform. Remember what I said earlier about GE picking the possibility of Rhode Island for their corporate headquarters? It wasn't just talk, because 3 months after their announcement to Boston, GE started a new digital technology business in Providence, adding 150 employees, I believe, with the possibility of adding 200 more. So it isn't Texas, it isn't Wisconsin, it's right next door in Rhode Island. The stepbrother that nobody liked is now making changes because they demonstrated courage to reform their pensions, to reform their benefits, and for leaders to say, whatever has been done hasn't worked, let's make the pivot. And what I'm encouraged about is this: I'm energized by what we did yesterday. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but what people should come away from is at least the legislative body has spoken. We can say everything we want about how difficult Governor Malloy is, but you know what? Until yesterday, we were just followers in the legislature. But you know what? Today, I can say that in a bipartisan basis, we stood up and said, whatever is happening in the past hasn't worked. And we are telling you, Governor, that the people have spoken, and it's about time you listen to them. And I will tell you, all of a sudden, the presentation will differ. The dialogue will differ for all the people that are so upset and literally have a foot and a half out of this state. Now have something to point to say, guess what? There's chance. There's hope. And I'm encouraged by that.
Okay, quickly.
Okay, so Bob, I mean, I would certainly say, if there's, I'm on the Finance Committee, if there's a plan for bonding that would work, I would certainly be willing to I'd certainly look at it. You know, a couple things I would say is the state has issued pension obligation bonds for teachers' retirement, and you can see where that got us, right? So this is one of the things the government wants to shift before it's exploding, and the governor wants to shift back on the town. So we have done that in the past. You know, with the bonds, typically do that. It's about changing the profile of your cash flows. You really can't change how much you owe. I mean, the pensions are an obligation that you have to pay out. You can do financial engineering and kind of transfer that into a bond, which you then have to pay out. And maybe it's different time horizon, and that time horizon might be better for you. But, you know, if you're switching one to the other, they kind of have to be equal in some way, in some general sense. So it might work, but I'm not, I would need to see a plan.
Okay, thank you. We're going to keep going.
Hi, Alan Graubert, 100 Kettle Creek Road. I also serve on the Weston Board of Finance. First of all, just in Bob's question, you're taking a state which has this long-term pension obligation. So I sort of consider that part of its debt. If you offer early buyouts, you are taking some debt off the balance sheet, replacing it with other potentially better debt. So it's not because your credit card's maxed out. You have a debt. That pension obligation, that unfunded pension obligation, is part of your balance sheet. So if you're going to have a better way to finance this out and offer early retirement, Adam, your early buyout of people who are willing to say, okay, I am looking forward to $250,000 of payout if I live till 80, but I'm willing to take $120,000 in the bank right now. That's how you curtail some of that. Corporations do it all the time, so it can be done. In any event.
Yeah, you know, you're right. It's certainly
Huh?
You're right.
But let me tell you something. Let me tell you something. Here was really my point. I have been a lifelong Democrat, and I swear to you, you are turning me into a Republican every day that I live in this Board of Finance and I listen to Governor Malloy. Okay, how in God's green earth, after sitting here listening to him for the last 3 months saying the legislature has to make the hard choices, everybody's got to start doing something, I'm coming up here with ideas. Now, after he gets his entire legislature to agree in a mind-blowing shift where Democrats cross over to the Republican, now he's going to say, oh, I'm going to veto this after hearing 2 houses of the legislature say, we're agreeing? How in hell does he do that?
I love your narrative.
All right.
That's absolutely mind-boggling. How in hell can he do that?
The thing is, he's promised to veto anything that's not what he wants.
Well, I get that, and believe me, and I'm going to just echo Mr. Ezzy's point, you're going to have litigation up over this pension proposal. Trust me. You are going to have this no matter what. That's going to have to come off the table. But anyway, he can do what he wants. I'm just saying to you, it is mind-boggling to me that you guys, that he believes that after both legislatures took the hard positions that he has been screaming for everybody to take for 4 months. I have my little favorite, the Hartford Courant and my Connecticut Mirror on my computer, and I hit it every morning. And every morning there's another speech by Malloy, and I've been listening to this for months. Now he's going to say, when you guys all get together, it's not my plan, so I'm going to veto it. What is it? It's absurd. I would recall him if I could. It's horrible. Anyway, it wasn't a question. There is no question here.
Okay,
Thank you.
that was my question. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Nina Daniel, Goodhill Road. Thank you, all of you, for being here. I'm sorry Tony had to leave. And thank you, Jonathan, for being here. Thank you for the bipartisan spirit that we're hearing here. It's very exciting to hear. I think I can represent just about everybody in town who would say that the idea of foisting the teacher pension obligation on our municipalities is a killer of our town's economy, our lifeblood, our educational system. And I ask you all to continue the good fight on that. We will be probably very willing to do something legally to defend ourselves, and I'll be reaching out to Jim Marpy and other selectmen, as I already have with Adam, to see if we can have an effect to protect ourselves. It's absolutely incumbent upon town leaders that we protect the town and our future. The other thing I'd like to say is whenever we're trying to work something out and we see a difficult situation, or we look at a SWOT analysis, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Weston and Westport and our towns around here have a lot of strengths. We have some weaknesses. We have opportunities and we have threats. The number one threat to the town of Weston is the state budget and the state policies. And all the things we've talked about today having to do with the pension obligations that have been unfunded and the teacher's pension obligation coming down the pike and all the other things that you are involved in the state budget are a threat to our lifeblood here in town. So we thank you for your work going forward. And in terms of an opportunity, I'd like to mention one thing that's come across my desk, which is Amazon. And Amazon is interested in finding, the corporation Amazon is interested in finding a second headquarters outside of Seattle. And one of the places they have looked at is Connecticut. The other thing, though, is they have certain criteria of where they would come. They would bring billions of dollars of business to the state of Connecticut. They would reinfuse the economy of any section of the state, and they are looking to be somewhere in an urban environment, suburban but near a population center of 1 million people, with educated people, which would describe Fairfield County. So the idea of having that as an opportunity would be extremely enticing and would help bail us all out of what's been 20-year decline, economic decline in the state. So I guess my last question to you is, what can we do to try to entice Amazon to come to Bridgeport or Stanford or someplace in Connecticut?
Thank you for the question. Anybody?
Well, I mean, it's certainly something to look at. The Amazon stuff came out recently. We've all been extremely busy the last few days, so I don't think anyone here has a close chance to look at. But there are some regional efforts going on. I mean, we have I've kind of reached out to the Bridgeport Regional Business Council, which is not the catchment that Weston is in, to see if some regional, I think it's going to, I mean, the state is working on it. I have not looked at the details, but I've heard them speak about it. Aside from that, I think some regions of the state, which is a good approach, are also getting together. You know, you and I are going to meet on Monday to talk about it. But I think looking at the RFP and putting together a regional a response, a request, filling out the RFP at a minimum, I think is certainly the right way to go. It's too good of an opportunity to do nothing. It's going to take, at a minimum, a certain group of towns cooperating. Possibly the state. I think the state's more focused in the Hartford area, which may not be the best thing for around here. But I do think it's something we do need to look at, which starts with the towns getting together and going through the RFP and seeing what makes sense. Yeah, I know.
And I would like to say on that note, just the anti-business frame and the disinterest in growing the economy, which is a great Bill Clinton expression, has carried through to this because it's a month before the RFP is due, and the State Office of Economic Opportunity has not done anything. So
I don't think that's a fair characterization.
Tell me why not.
I believe that they are certainly eager and are working in that direction. I think we owe it to you to find out how they proceeded. We're not the only state they're looking at in the Northeast. You can bet that everybody's putting their best foot forward.
I'll be quick in saying, here's the bottom line. I would do anything I can in my legislative role to bring an Amazon into the state. But let us not forget, we should be having and demonstrating the same kind of initiative, enthusiasm for any business that wants to come into our state. Any mom and pop operation. Why is it the lure of Amazon that we get excited? We should be looking to help every single business that is interested in our state, and that we should double down and support every single business that is in our state right now to help them succeed. So I think that's the key, and the ecosystem we talked about, predictability, sustainability, and transparency. Unless we demonstrate that on a constant basis and a micro and a macro basis, we're just wishful thinking. We're a state of great possibilities and a great history, but it's about time to stop wishing and go and do.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that does it for all of us. Thank you very much to the three remaining for coming. And thank you for coming, and I hope you'll join us on October 7th. You're welcome in the Town Hall meeting room, where we'll have our debates for the municipal elections. Thank you very much.